Hello beautiful family. So I wasn't going to make any videos at the present moment while I was doing the 11/11 story, but with Israel and Hamas doing what they are, I feel a need to speak on this. Now, I don't want to oversimplify what's gone on here, the journey of Israel since the Balfour Treaty, leading up to the 6-day war of the Arabs, etc. It's a very complex political situation. But I do want to take all of that out. Rumi said something. Out beyond your ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field, and I'll meet you there. That field is the only place that this problem and problems like it in our human journey can be solved. And so I'm going to say, let go of any emotional attachment to this story, any emotional attachment to sides, etc., any emotional attachment to wrongdoing and right doing, and just sit in that neutral space of the field a moment and hear this. The warring between Jew and Islam and Arab and even Christianity as well is just a never-ending story. But there is a common ground and a reality that should be looked upon, because the Abrahamic faiths have at least some commonalities that you can build on. And if, however, these faiths were understood, if the leaders of these nations, if the leaders of these religions inside these nations were emotionally and spiritually mature, these problems would not be happening. Because when you have leaders who are spiritually mature, it can filter down into the peacekeeping forces that you have, like police, to uphold law, because you're always going to need things like that. You're always going to have humans who dip down into their lower primitive nature, and you need some persons there to deal with that. But when you have spiritually mature leaders and emotionally mature leaders, that changes everything, and that's something that's absent around the whole planet for Abrahamic faiths in the most part. Many of the leaders are emotionally and spiritually immature. And how dare I say that, you might say. How dare you say that? Well, hear me out. Let's find one common ground between these faiths, and we can do that with Moses. Moses is a common ground between these Abrahamic faiths. It's present in all of them. Those leaders and that leadership look upon Moses as a story of someone liberating slaves, and only that, and it's a historical event, and judging all of these stories historically only as a history book becomes a problem in the modern day, because you start to bring forth things that were not meant to be brought forth into the modern day. Moses, in the true deep sense of the mystic interpretation of that story, starts his journey in Egypt. Egypt is the lower mind. Egypt is the lower mind. He has a problem with his brother, stepbrother, however you want to name it, the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is the ego who will keep you in bondage in that lower mind. Moses requires an ability to leave the lower mind and take with him the Israelites. The Israelite is the Jew is not a Jew outwardly in the Bible, as it says. A Jew is not a Jew who is one outwardly. It's a person who wishes to circumcise, cut away the lower nature, represented as Egypt. So Moses must flee his lower nature with that higher aspect of himself to escape the bondage of his ego holding him back, the Pharaoh. And this is represented often. He must hold that energy high inside of his body. That's why his staff is a snake when he casts it down and consumes the lower nature, because the staff of Moses is representing his energy going up his body and allowing him to stay in the higher mind. That's what this represents. That's why in the desert there was Moses with a bronze serpent on top of his staff healing everybody, and there was snakes at the same time biting and killing people. It was the representation of the same energy rising and falling. The lower nature of man expressed in the lower attributes of yourself, the gluttony, etc., and the higher nature of man expressed in the heavenly delights of the pursuit of peace on this planet. The staff is also held up during the war. And if the staff is lowered, the lower mind overcomes. This is what is represented in the war inside the story of Moses. And it's constantly speaking about this. Moses gets lost in the wilderness. And what does he find? 7 sisters. Finally, after being lost in the wilderness of his lower self, he finds union with the 7 endocrine glands and lives in the heavenly place, the higher ideals of a man. When he reaches the Red Sea, he must cross the Red Sea. Red in mysticism is emotion. And here answers the problem of all of the wars on the planet and this conflict as well. Emotional immaturity. The promised land is on the other side of the Red Sea. The bondage of the ego and the lower mind, Egypt, is on this side of the Red Sea. We must part the emotion. We must separate from emotion and cross the Red Sea. And there are those today protesting all around the world, Free Palestine, etc., who are so emotional that they will never help solve the problem because they are caught in the Egypt side, they're not at the promised land. And from the promised land side we will find solutions. Because from the promised land, when you cross the emotions and you cross the Red Sea, when you get over there and the Pharaoh comes chasing after you, but it's washed away behind you. Because once you are in that state where you are separated from emotional turmoil, emotional response, when you are out beyond your ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field, I'll meet you there, as Rumi said. When you are there, you can start to address the problems, because only from there will the problems be addressed. Because if Hamas's leaders were in the actual promised land, the internal promised land, they would not fire a rocket. If Israel's leaders were in the actual promised land, the internal promised land, they would not fire an airstrike. It would be impossible. They wouldn't be able to do it because they'd be in the presence of a loving, peaceful God. And until you are in that presence, you must cross over the emotion and come into that timeless space. The longer we continue using our words to try and bargain and change and all of this, we incorporate time. And the transformational presence of God in that timeless space cannot wash over those persons in positions of power. And so they will continue involving time, separating from God in doing so, and from that they will make decisions from Egypt, from the lower mind, which means they will retaliate with airstrikes, or they will fire rockets when they're annoyed, or they will use brutality on the streets because they're spiritual leaders those who are not able to have the time to put discipline into that are emotionally and spiritually immature. Because a police force who is attending churches and mosques and so on and so forth, who have leaders who are spiritually immature, will have no direction and also no space. Society is providing space for spiritual leaders to find that maturity. They are not. They are working, dealing with family. It's up to the leaders to impart that wisdom upon them. It's up to the leaders to give them the timeless presence of God through their words somehow. But they're not. And the world over, this is our problem. The world over is that we are in the bondage of Egypt, and we don't even know that it represents the lower self. We don't even acknowledge that it's there to be liberated from. Instead, we believe these things to be purely a historical story. And the world is in the mess that it's in right now because we are believing these deeply profound texts purely historically. We are not listening to the depths of the true mystic side of it, which is where that transformational presence of God, whether you're Muslim, Jew, or Christian, God's presence is no different. It's indescribable. You will battle with parable forever to try and lead people there. Words are there. Scriptures are there to bring down the carnal mind and to let a person enter the presence, the timeless presence of God. That's what they're there for. That's what a good spiritual leader is there for. But right now in that part of the world and all over the world, the leaders are not doing that. The leaders are speaking historically. The leaders are conceptualizing love as something that we must enact through these words and labels, through time, instead of having this timeless experience of it. And the leaders are not even trying to lead people to that direct presence of God. They are just trying to tell a part of them that is totally and utterly unable to deal with the supernatural aspects of God and the supernatural love that can come from having that presence of God, to behave in a supernaturally loving way. And that's why we can't find peace, because only by spending time in his presence do we find peace. But when they never shut up with their words and just lead people to that presence, then people never ever actually enter the presence. And when they're in the presence, the supernatural presence and the love of God, that God changes them. And they will make decisions based on the promised land because they've crossed the emotion. And there are people listening to me now who will have so much going on in their brain. But this is not fair, but this is not fair, but this is this. And it's all emotion. It's all Egypt and Red Sea. And my point is this, it's a complicated topic, but it will never be solved from the Egypt side of the Red Sea. It will only be solved, metaphorically, Egypt meaning the lower self. It will only be solved by detaching from your emotion, becoming emotionally and spiritually mature, and going to the promised land and discussing it from there, from the field, as Rumi said. Because from there, people will start to come together in the same supernatural love and forgiveness that God offers us. We are offered to be clean in front of God at every moment when we surrender to him. And that means that we should be able to offer that to others, but we can't. But as humans, we can get close to it, if not do it. But we must acknowledge this. We must acknowledge our own immaturity, however difficult it might be. And we must acknowledge the immaturity of our leaderships. And we must acknowledge the spiritual immaturity of revenge and retaliation. And we must acknowledge that, because only when two sides actually come to the promised land together, the internal promised land, the actual presence of God, that supernatural loving presence, that's when we find peace. And that's why the solution lays internally, inside all of these leaders. It doesn't lay inside politics and etc. The solutions will be found there. The solutions will be found in diplomacy, but not ever will they work until the way of life for these religious states changes to one where we acknowledge that we must live from the eternal promised land. It's the only way. There's no other way. And that's the direction humanity must take if we are to find a planetary peace. God bless, guys. Bye.
When you look into your imagination, we'll begin with a spin, traveling in the world of my creation, living there. You will see what you truly wish to be. If you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it. Anything you want to do it. Want to change the world, but nothing to it. There